What are some disturbing facts about the US government? Story 1. This is nothing compared to the Tuskegee experiment and also the time they used United States soldiers for atomic bomb testing, where they had stimulated battlefields out in the middle of nowhere with live US soldiers out there. And they would detonate an atomic bomb and have the soldiers walk towards it and practice response drills. So the military knew how to train soldiers to keep fighting and respond properly to an atomic bomb explosion during warfare. They were told to cover their eyes, and many reported being able to see the bones in their hands through their closed eyes when the bombs would detonate. And that's not even the least of the messed up stuff the good old USA has done to its own people. Not to mention the messed up stuff the USA has done to other countries and small islands. America is great, my butt. And the people look at you and treat you like you are not right in the head for feeling like the government would hurt its own people in heinous ways in current times. Story 2. Letting insurance companies dictate the access and quality of care for their customers. Doctors, nurses, and surgeons don't get to decide what is covered or not. What is essential or not, the insurance people do. Life-saving drugs have to be pre-approved not by the pharmacist or a specialist, but if the insurance company thinks it's worth covering or not. Even if we can't do any sort of public health care option, putting it in the hands of insurance companies is a massive mistake. Story 3. Convincing people that anything labeled a conspiracy is fiction and tinfoil hat material. It's amazing how quickly the majority dismisses things the second it's labeled a conspiracy. But for real, the most shady thing the US does is actively engaging in propaganda directed at its own citizens. The US did a lot of research and analysis on German propaganda and its effectiveness, not only domestically, but against enemy combatants as well. The takeaway was that propaganda is most effective when the recipient thinks it is coming from a neutral source, such as a news broadcast. During World War II, both sides would show news broadcasts to troops in order to raise morale and dehumanize the enemy. But the predecessor to the CIA saw how effective it was in Germany in pacifying the masses even as the Reich was imploding. Story 4. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What happens when you target civilians? The videos of how the resulting Japanese radiation poisoning looks should be mandatory education in America, just like the Holocaust is mandatory education in Germany. And there should be a treatment toward the Japanese that is equal to the German treatment of Israel. 2. The indefinite war against terror. I'm sure if half of the Americans knew back then what we know now, including the claims of WMDs that are lies, the claims that Al-Qaeda was involved, lies, and the claims that it would end as soon as terror was exterminated, infinite warfare, so a lie. Most Americans would go, nah, it was horrible, but we vote against war. 3. The Hague Invasion Act. Basically, the US says it will start a war if their members are ever accused of war crimes or held captive because of those. Not the best practice if you have things like Abu Ghraib on your slate, but very understandable why the US would put that into law. Story 5. Agent Orange depleted uranium arms that polluted battlefields, people's homeland, and left generations of people with birth defects after the war was done, declaring war on a nation based on a false pretense of fighting terror, while doing nothing to the actual country that orchestrated the attack. At the same time, dragging other nations into this war and tearing relations with, example, France, who you would not exist without, because they didn't want to be involved, and then causing such instability that massive terrorist organizations blossomed out of it, then patting ourselves on the back for fixing a problem that the US started in the first place, except the issue is not even 100% fixed. Refusal to condemn terrorism from a particular viewpoint in order to protect your voter base, denying their own citizens accessible health care, claiming it as something only people lucky or wealthy enough should have, but making weapons considered a basic right, beyond Agent Orange in and of itself, but even our own soldiers being told that it was relatively safe when the higher-ups knew it wasn't. I had a good friend who struggled with 2 cancers and a chronic respiratory issue for 30 years, before succumbing to it about this time last year due to handling that stuff during Vietnam. Story 6. The Diego Garcia incident in 1968, which is also one of the worst things the UK government has done. For the UK to continue purchasing nuclear missiles from America, they asked to rent out the British island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean to use as a naval base. The UK then subsequently sent soldiers onto the island, forced all of the inhabitants off of the island, exterminated anybody who resisted, destroyed all homes, and killed all the animals. So US soldiers could then turn the island into a naval base. Any ex-inhabitants who tried to speak out about the incident were immediately silenced and punished, and the details of the incident were only recently made public. The island is still a joint UK-US naval base. To this day. Story 7. Hard to rank them, but the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a US false flag operation to establish the pretext to invade Vietnam to stop the spread of communism, leading to the absolutely useless deaths of millions of military and civilians, only to have the US pull out and cede control of the entire country to communist control. The most messed up thing about it is that our government knew it was an unwinnable war, but we stayed there anyway, throwing more bodies on the pile. The news media kept a daily running count of US dead. The US Gov team measured success in terms of the number of enemy dead. Story 8. Did everyone forget COINTELPRO? Or do you just know that it is still going on, so you're afraid to mention it? COINTELPRO was the FBI/CIA/FED program to infiltrate and destroy any groups that were considered left on the political spectrum. It involved not only placing people in those organizations, frequently as agent provocateurs, but murder, financing militias, inside the United States, mind you, and putting people in jail for life, many of whom are still there. That's the thing about COINTELPRO. For all we know, it's still going on. In fact, given the findings of some researchers on the Antifa movement, in which police put agent provocateurs into the movement to ratchet up violence so that the police could respond violently, it absolutely is still going on. Story 9, I think this question would be better asked in reverse, honestly. The history of the US is basically a collection of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and human rights violations, since human rights became a thing. However, if you want me to pick out a specific example, dropping the atomic bombs on Japan, 2 over the course of 3 days that immediately ended about 300,000 lives, documented as about 120,000, with many thousands more dying in the aftermath, and not just to radioactive fallout. Why? Because Japan blew up a few ships. A lot of people will try and argue, well, more people would have died, the war would have continued. You're probably right. But to say that dropping nuclear weapons on civilian populations as a show of force was the lesser of two evils, I'm poised to say that you're an idiot. The entire reason the US even joined the war, as a military combatant, was revenge. Our history is rooted in it. Most recent and blatant example I can give you is the bombing of the Middle East after 9/11. We didn't do that because people in Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan were full to the brim with terrorists. We did that because we just outright blamed the Muslims who live there. One day killed 3,000 Americans. One day later, we eliminated 30,000 civilians. I digress. What we did to Japan, as well as what we did to most Asian Americans, even second-generation Asian Americans, was appalling. Story 10. What they did to Guatemala. All the worst aspects of them toppling democratically elected leaders in foreign countries and installing a dictator puppet state that would serve U.S. interests all into one. Puppets like Jorge Ubico allowed United Fruit to buy up most of the damn arable land in Guatemala and basically make slaves out of the population. Military juntas were set up, hundreds of thousands of civilians, including women and children, murdered and exploited, and most of these dictators being trained at the U.S. Army School of the Americas, now known as WINSEC. They had done this in places like Iran, East Timor, Chile, El Salvador, and Cuba, pre-Castro. But Guatemala is all of their worst sins rolled into one. This was my piss-poor summarization of the situation, so feel free to Google it. Story 11. Unfortunately, there are quite a few, and a number of them are listed here. I gotta say, dubbing one atrocity the worst is hard, because so many terrible things happened. However, I am a little surprised I didn't see any mention of Operation Paperclip, where the US government essentially let Germans get away with horrific war crimes because we could benefit from them. I won't go into great detail because I'm sure you are all familiar with this story. Unfortunately, it seems nothing will ever happen to give justice to the millions massacred by German war criminals who were not only given pardons and citizenship, but given jobs with the government. So I'm not trying to say this is worse than others listed here, but I feel it deserves an honorable mention as a pretty horrible thing our government did. Story 12. Convenience people that their party is more important than their country every election cycle. If you actually take the time to talk to someone and actually listen to people, you'll learn that we actually usually want the same things. Granted, we have our disagreements, but usually it isn't so bad as both the establishment and media make it out to be. That all said, the establishment, Republicans, and Democrats work together almost all the time, screwing over you, the American people, while you spend most of your time yelling at your neighbor because you are convinced it is us versus them. It is, but we are the us, and the establishment is really the them. More than often, it is not your neighbor you should worry about. Story 13. I'm amazed how no one has mentioned the Move bombing. The police discharged over 10,000 rounds of ammunition in a high-density residential area. When Move and other residents would not comply with the evictions, the police gave the order to bomb the building. The explosion immediately set fire to the building. Move could not leave for the fear of being shot, and the fire department, scared of also being shot, said to let the building burn, leading to the burning of buildings and homes for blocks. Story 14. Paying opposition political parties and paying people at the voting stations in third world democracies in order to get pro American and pro European governments. When it doesn't work, go to war, aka Vietnam. War is nothing to do with communism, like 99% uneducated, ignorant Americans believe. This has led to wars, poverty, erosion of civil liberties, and widespread long-term deaths. For example, did you know the USA and EU, along with other European countries, have blocked medical supply to Iran in the middle of COVID-19 epidemic? Indian, Russian, and Chinese air forces had to get involved to take medical supply to save lives in Iran, using human lives to maintain political, economic, and social controls by the USA have led to major issues in Vietnam, Korea, Japan, Sri Lanka, India, Iran, Oman, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and the list goes on and on. Chilling effects of American imperialism have caused millions of deaths and suffering that is hard to measure. Story 15. Masquerading as a champion of freedom and democracy. From our very inception, we've been an imperialist nation, starting with the driving out of the native peoples for our own benefit. The country had to fight a civil war to figure out if slavery was wrong. Robber barons in the Industrial Revolution ruined the lives of immigrants, working class people, paying them next to nothing in wages and violently cracking down on attempts to unionize and gain rights, while the government did nothing. During World War II, we dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, killing thousands, while the effectiveness of it ending the war and saving lives is debatable. During the Cold War, we overthrew countless democratically elected leaders and replaced them with brutal dictators who happened to like capitalism. The black community only gained basic human rights in the past 70 years and still faces racism today. Recently, Bush oversaw the imperialist invasion of the Middle East, destabilizing the region even further from our previous Cold War activities. And today, where the media controls the flow of information, where propaganda convinces people that if they just work harder, they too can be successful, demonizing any kind of change from the status quo. I'm ashamed to be an American, especially right now. Story 16. How much they truly are in debt. As an American, we are told $20 trillion officially. I have a feeling they're using funny accounting, and the numbers are truly much, much higher. Interesting. Forgive my ignorance on this, but what does that really mean? Could the debt come due someday? It will all come due someday, but not all at the same time. The figure is the total of all the government's debts, whenever they may come due. The government borrows money from people, just as your bank borrows money from you through a positive balance in your checking account. This is a good thing. It means taxes are lower, but people get their money back. The biggest lender to the US government is the US government. For example, Social Security money has to go somewhere between receiving it and paying it out, so they lend it to other parts of the government. But you can lend them money yourself, and your bank probably lends your money to the government too. The biggest chunk of that debt is to the American people themselves, i.e., social programs like Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. The money we owe to other countries, while still enormous, is far less than 23 trillion. Our own social programs are what is bankrupting us. And unless something changes, it's only going to get worse, because the ratio of senior citizens to workforce age people is only skewing more and more toward seniors. It's very likely that we'll eventually end up like Japan with a shrinking population and an even faster shrinking workforce. Story 17. The extent of its involvement in Central and South American coups the U.S. for an entire century. Socialism in all forms is our number one enemy, and we will wield the entire might of our empire to destroy it wherever it exists on God's earth. The U.S. in the 21st century. Oh, we actually had nothing to do with numerous violent overthrows of democratically elected socialist administrations in countries we've been forcibly extracting resources from for generations. It's definitely a coincidence that they all just happened to fall to completely organic violent uprisings that were in no way funded and armed with American money and guns that are only made here. How fortunate for us that every single one that succeeded happened to be extremely cooperative with our government. and aligned with our interests over those of their own people. Socialism, man. Why doesn't it ever work? Now, please, let's give a round of applause for our brave CIA operative, the real heroes that keep us safe every day. Story 18. That we live in a democracy. Most democracies are oligarchies, the others are dictatorships. The fundament of democracy is that the power is in the hands of the people. Since we can't be several millions voting for each decision, we delegate our power to a select few, U.S. Congress, French Assembly, etc. The right to vote, the number of political parties, the separation of powers, etc., do not actually ensure we are in a democracy. In reality, the only way to respect the fundamentals is for the select few to be a realistic sample of the people, which definitely isn't the case. In France, for example, politicians earn between 1,2000 euro, base income for a congressman, and several 1,000 euro for the ones who work the system, whereas the median salary in France is around 1780 euro. There are many more factors, but salary alone shows how far apart the people and the ones in power are. But everybody believes that we live in a democracy because, well, we have the right to vote. Story 19. The government doesn't often lie outright. Instead, the government manipulates by perpetuating misconceptions and by centering public attention on favored topics. For instance, there are many discussions which are profitable regardless of the outcome. So politicians will take sides, even if they don't personally care about these issues or don't agree with the side they take. There isn't necessarily a conspiracy. Actually, I think a lot of underhanded government doings are emergent behaviors. The politician wants to get reelected and to make money, and by acting to accomplish this, they naturally form robust systems of manipulation and control. All of the hot-button topics are rich in the outcomes favored by politicians. For instance, there is a lot of money and passion in guns. So a Democrat will threaten gun control legislation, appeasing anti-gun voters while at the same time causing gun sales to skyrocket. The ideal Democrat will profit from both of these outcomes. A Republican will threaten to deregulate guns, appeasing pro-gun voters while gun manufacturers pay out in donations in exchange for the security of their market in the long term. The result will be a wash. Very little legislation passed either way, but the politicians will have gotten the money and the votes. Meanwhile, the public is increasingly polarized by the constant and artificial bickering on TV. The public is manipulated by this emergent and unconscious system into caring about topics which don't actually matter to the average person. Rather, those topics make politicians rich. Of course, this means that our country wastes a whole lot of time and money spinning its wheels. This, I think, is the game being played. I think there are a lot of these games. Straight lies don't propagate very well. People figure them out. Lies tend to be an individual thing. A politician might lie, but the government as a whole is more of a manipulator. Story 2019-64, Brazilian coup. Fearing that the government of Brazilian President João Goulart would, in the words of U.S. Ambassador Lincoln Gordon, make Brazil the China of the 1960s, the United States backed a 1964 coup led by Humberto Castelo Branco, then Chief of Staff of the Brazilian Army. In the days leading up to the coup, the CIA encouraged street rallies against the government and provided fuel and arms of non-U.S. origin to those backing the military. I think we ought to take every step that we can. Be prepared to do everything that we need to do, President Lyndon Johnson told his advisors. Planning the coup, according to declassified government records obtained by the National Security Archive, the Brazilian military went on to govern the country until 1985. A number of reports reveal the numbers of suspects arrested in Brazil and the different techniques used to torture suspects during the process of interrogation. A report written in April 16, 1973, to the U.S. Department of State titled Widespread Arrests and Psychophysical Interrogation of Suspected Subversive gave specific details that accounted for what happened in Brazil. According to the report, there had been a dramatic increase in arrests in 1973, with a specific week period. The majority of suspects were university students. These students were arrested within several weeks in the Rio area. When arrested and interrogated, the suspects were subjected to the old methods of physical violence, which sometimes caused death. The increase in the number of suspects stemmed from police reports, especially on individuals who were jailed before. Another report, dated April 18, 1973, highlighted that over 300 individuals were arrested for subversive activities. Though the report listed students as the largest portion of the arrests, individuals such as university professors, journalists, and physicians were also detained. The methods for torture included the subject being unclothed and either subjected to darkness, sound-based, temperature, or electrical torture, and other methods like hanging the subject by their arms and legs. The document also makes note of the use of the Brazilian police in the interrogation and torture process. Individuals labeled as hardened terrorists or known radical subversives usually faced an expedited execution process. A common practice for executions was to utilize a technique known as the shootout technique, in which the executed subject was deemed to have died in a shootout with the police. Story 21. There are some Democrats that, sure, they're idealists, but whenever they start to get gray hairs, they start to realize, oh, yeah, I did like providing all these social programs to help people, but I'd like to keep getting elected and paid, so how do we keep them there? Welfare programs are designed to entrap the poor and keep them where they're at in order for Democrats to maintain power and viability. Voters in need vote Democrat indeed. Republicans, for the most part, want to represent their constituency. And as they get older, they want that yacht they've been looking at forever. So you start seeing the pork bills being shelled out, which may mess their constituents and may be mutually beneficial. So it's really a matter of which kind of corruption you want. I vote for mutually beneficial, sometimes kind. Even when Democrats are young idealists, I don't like their ideas and their lack of pragmatism. Story 22. We have to get people out of this habit of defending your team at all costs. Teams being Democrats versus Republicans/progressives versus conservative. Most of our elected representatives in Congress on both sides are bought and have no obligation to the rest of us. Until we get all this money out of politics, they will not represent anything but what that money tells them to represent. Just enough voters buy into this Democrats versus conservatives crap to keep anything from changing anytime soon. Story 23. Face facts. The internet was largely unregulated, and it's going to catch up with physical life. How many of you guys are flipping your crap over the government's ability to go into your house with a search warrant? Ability to ban weapons/products? Regulating industry? Driving cop cars around searching for criminals? Tasering somebody when they don't comply? From my armchair perspective, we should call for a national debate and conference on what's acceptable for the government to do. You can't stop people from abusing their power just because a piece of paper says so. There needs to be proof provided in the courts, since that place is the only place where that piece of paper matters.